what would then be A, your strategy to keep God absolutely sovereign, and B, what would be the question you would ask God in that context?
Yeah, the question that I would ask him, well, the Lord, what are these things? Tell me.
Welcome to Closer to Truth, where we explore deep questions of existence, including arguments for and against the existence of God, and if there were a God, what might follow. Closer to Truth promotes no privileged position. Rather, we seek precision and clarity in diverse, even conflicting ideas. We do not mind challenging current belief. I am speaking with William Lane Craig about his philosophical theology research projects over the course of his remarkable career. Here, God's absolute sovereignty and self-sufficiency, God's aseity, and how Platonic abstract objects, forms, numbers, logic, etc., may threaten an autonomous God. Bill has authored or edited over 30 books, including God Over All, Divine Aseity, and the Challenge of Platonism, and his scholarly work, God and Abstract Objects, The Coherence of Theism, Aseity. Bill is recognized as a leading defender of theism in general and of Christianity in specific. Bill, welcome again. Why did Platonic abstract objects frighten you? Why did they threaten an absolutely sovereign God?
I first became acquainted with this challenge in 1982 when I attended a philosophical conference at which Tom Morris spoke on the relationship between God and abstract objects. And I had never heard a more powerful objection to the existence of God than that which was posed by the existence of these uncreated abstract objects which exist just as necessarily as God and are independent of him, which contradicts the fundamental property of God of existing a se, or simply by himself, being self-existent. And it struck me that this was a more powerful objection than the problem of evil or any other sort of atheistic objection I had ever heard, and I did not know how to answer it. Moreover, Morris's own attempt to solve the problem, I think, was painfully unconvincing to everyone who heard him. And so that really left me with a quandary. Well, I just kind of put the issue on the back burner for the next couple of decades while I worked on divine eternity and divine omniscience. But then, after those projects were completed, I decided to take up this project in earnest. And I began a study of God and abstract objects that lasted 13 years, Robert. It was incredible study. And as a result, I came to philosophical peace about this issue and am convinced that there is a good answer to the challenge posed by Platonism to God's aseity.
Good. Well, I look forward to discussing that. I have to tell you that when we did our first interview in 2006, literally 15 years ago, virtually now, I had heard this issue of God and abstract objects. And I just mentioned it to you maybe in one of the questions or maybe before a question. I don't remember. And I was astounded at your immediate reaction because I didn't know very much about it other than it was an interesting topic. You said to me, and I can see in my mind's eye you saying it, you said, Robert, that's like a dagger in my heart of the concept of God's existence. And I've never forgotten that. I was taken aback, and that motivated me to really make this a focal point of one of the themes of Closer to Truth, and you've been a major contributor to it. So I think it's a fascinating probe. I was stunned by your the emotional power that you had with it. But as I've gone into it, independent of God and independent of abstract, it's a very deep probe to understand the metaphysics of reality. So thrilled that you've done this, and I look forward to do it. So When you began with that mindset, what were some of your initial grounding assumptions? What beliefs or even doctrinal commitments were sacrosanct? I assume that God had to maintain this absolute aseity in one way or another, or else.
For me, the non-negotiable, the sacrosanct assumption was the assumption of divine aseity, that God and God alone is the only self-existent being, and that everything else has been created by him. And the question that I faced was, how is that view defensible in the face of Platonism, the view that there are uncreated, eternal, necessarily existing abstract objects?
So let's start with that argument, because that is a very common one. We speak to many, especially mathematicians, who vehemently support that view. What is the so-called indispensability argument for Platonism? Assume you're arguing for the other side.
This is the most, in fact, almost the only argument for Platonism on the contemporary scene, and it is that reference to abstract objects is simply indispensable. We can't get rid of them. So the argument goes like this. If we say that there are certain things, or we refer to those things with singular terms, terms that pick them out, then if we regard our statements as true, we are ontologically committed to the reality of those objects. And then the second premise would be that there are true statements that refer to and quantify over abstract objects. And from that, it follows that therefore these abstract objects exist.
And existing, they not only exist, but they exist necessarily means you can't get rid of them. That's the indispensability part.
Yes, though that can be challenged, and there have been some who did challenge it. They would say, yes, there are abstract objects, but they are created by God. That's one option. That was Tom Morris's option in his original talk that I heard in 1982. So that's a kind of modified Platonism that Morris referred to as absolute creation, that God creates these abstract objects by his intellection in his mind. He thinks them into being.
And the natural rejoinder to that, very simplistically, is just say he didn't do that, then what? Because
Well, the problem with absolute creation is that it seems to confront a bootstrapping problem. And this can be explained most easily by means of properties. Properties are thought to be abstract objects. But in order to create properties, you would already have to have property.
right.
For example, to create the property of being powerful, you would have to already be powerful. So in order to create this property, you already have to have it. And so you've got this kind of vicious circularity or bootstrapping problem that attends the absolute creationist view and that makes many thinkers uncomfortable with it.
You have in your books a very clear diagram of the alternative explanations from all perspectives in one diagram. At the top is an abstract object. I think you use mathematical objects, but it could be the totality of objects. And then you have a realism side, that they are real in some sense, and an anti-realism side. And there's a third you have is like, it's a meaningless question, but I don't think you pay a lot of attention to that. It's those other two sides. Walk me through that chart so that we can see the universe of all potential explanations
Okay.
for abstract objects.
I have to say, Robert, that chart is worth the price of the book alone. If the reader takes away nothing else but that chart, he will
I
be.
agree with that. I agree with that.
For the first several years that I worked on this, for years, I felt as though I were walking through a dense fog. And I would occasionally come upon a building or some structures, and I would go inside and I would explore them and I would learn to understand them. But then I would launch off again into the fog until I would come to some other structures and I would explore them. But I couldn't see the landscape as a totality of how these things were related to each other. And finally, after several years, the fog began to lift, and I began to see the landscape of different views on this topic and how they relate to each other. And that chart is the fruit of that study. So, as you say, I take mathematical objects like numbers and sets as my departure point, and we ask the question, do these exist or don't they? Now, if you say they do exist, then you're a realist of some sort. If you say they do not exist, then you are a non realist or anti realist about these things. And then in between them, there are some people who say there is no answer to the question. They neither exist nor do not exist, and they're called realists. Now, if you take the realist side of the diagram, a further question arises. If these objects exist, are they abstract objects or are they concrete objects? And if you say that they are abstract objects, then you're some sort of Platonist. You think there are these causally effete entities that really exist but don't have any causal impact on anything. And if you take that route, then you can say either that these are created or uncreated. If you say they're uncreated, you're a classical Platonist. If you say they're created, then you would be an absolute creationist. So that's the part of the diagram that deals with a realist abstract view of these objects. The other realist view would say, no, these are not abstract, they're concrete objects, in fact. And these concrete objects could be one of two types. They could either be physical objects or they could be mental objects in someone's mind. Now, the view that they're physical objects isn't represented very much today, but this would be a view that would say, for example, that mathematical objects are just marks on paper. They're just ink marks. And this would be a sort of formalism where you just play games with these marks. But the more popular view would be some sort of mental entities. And these mental entities could be either thoughts in human minds or thoughts in God's mind. The view that they are thoughts in human minds is sometimes called psychologism, and the view that they are thoughts in the mind of God is often called conceptualism. And the historic Western theistic position on God and abstract objects is divine conceptualism, that abstract objects are actually thoughts in the mind of God. And that was the view that I thought I would adopt when I began this study. And it would still be my fallback position if my own position doesn't work. But as I began to explore this issue, Robert, it became clear to me that there really isn't any good reason to be a realist at all about these weird things. And I began to discover that there's a cornucopia of anti-realist views about such objects. For example, pretense theory that says these are simply make-believe. Or there are paraphrastic strategies that says we can paraphrase away our commitments in language to abstract objects. Or there's figuralism, which says that these are sort of existential metaphors that are not ontologically committing, and so on and so forth. A whole slew of anti-realist views. And as I studied these, I came to realize that my fellow Christian philosophers have almost no acquaintance with these anti-realist views at all. They have not even begun to scratch the surface of these. And so as I explored them, I became convinced that an anti-realist perspective is much more plausible. And that would say then that God is the creator of everything that exists because there are no abstract objects. Um, these are just useful fictions or matters of pretense, and therefore they pose no threat to divine aseity. So that's the chart.
Yeah, it's a great chart, and it really gives a clarity to the universe of possibilities. So, as you have concluded that fictionalism is your top choice, you made it very clear that you're not you're grounded and committed to the idea that something must maintain God's absolute aseity, and fictionalism is your first choice. But
No, well, it's not, Robert, if I might interrupt.
okay, sure.
Fictionalism, properly speaking, is the view that statements that refer to or quantify over abstract objects are all false. They're uniformly false. And I don't agree with that. I think that these statements are true, but I reject, and here we get a little technical, I reject the criterion of ontological commitment that is assumed by those who say that if we quantify over or refer to things in statements we take to be true, we are ontologically committed to their reality. I think that that criterion of ontological commitment is a gratuitous metaphysical assumption um, that we should reject and certainly are at liberty to reject. And therefore, we don't need to be fictionalists. We don't need to say these statements are all false. We can say they're true, but they're just not ontologically committing. And so I find neutralism, as I call it, to be a much more congenial view. Neutralism says that our statements about numbers and sets and propositions and properties are just ontologically neutral. And that we do not make ontological commitments simply by making statements like that. We would need to do more to commit ourselves ontologically to their reality.
And so the abstract objects has a truth value to them when you do these operations, but by doing that, that is not making an ontological commitment to their absolute existence in some fundamental ontological sense. Is that
That is right. That is exactly it. So
and and that's defined as neutralism. Is that a category, or is that your own sort of creation?
this is a viewpoint that is defended, for example, by Jody Azuni at Tufts University. He referred to his view as deflationary nominalism. But he said on many occasions that these statements are neutral with respect to their ontological commitment. So I coined the term neutralism to describe his view. And Professor Azuni agreed with the appropriateness of that term and said, yes, that his view is appropriately referred to as neutralism.
Yeah, and that maybe has the same result, but has a different flavor to deflationary. Deflationary sort of gives you a different kind of emotion to it, but it's the same thing.
Yes, I think that's true. Boy, we get into all sorts of questions here about truth that are very interesting. He has a deflationary view of truth that I find very attractive. But in any case, neutralism just says when I say things like, um, there are deep differences between Republicans and Democrats, I am not committing myself ontologically to the reality of something called differences, and that some of them, moreover, are deep. That's just not the way language works. We use singular terms and expressions like there is and there are without ontological commitment all the time in ordinary language.
Bill, give me a sense for those 13 years. They weren't all in the fog, I'm sure, but that was the metaphor that you used, and it seems quite apt. What were the issues that you were dealing with? Uh, did you have misunderstandings? Were there surprises along the way? blind alleys you wound up in?
Oh, it was so enormously educational and interesting working on these topics. Very, very insightful. After some years, it became clear to me that these anti realist views could be classified by which premise of the indispensability argument they rejected. Some of these anti realist views reject that criterion of ontological commitment that I spoke of. And so they would affirm the truth of mathematical statements and other abstract language talk, but they would deny that it's ontologically committing. On the other hand, there are other anti realists who accept that criterion of ontological commitment, but then they deny the truth of those statements. And so that helped to clarify the relationship between these different anti realist views based on which premise of the indispensability argument they disputed.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Where you looked at each one of the premises and then see which ones were contradicted. But the first one, I could easily follow you on. The second one, I had trouble on. Something could be you can make an ontological commitment to something that is not true. Is that a neo-Minogian kind of position?
Oh, well, Meinong is one of the alternatives, or neo-Meinongianism. Meinong was um, an early 20th century Austrian philosopher who believed that there are non existent objects, there are things that do not exist. And Platonists inveigh against Meinong for his self contradiction to say there are things that do not exist. And clearly, Meinong did not think that the expression there are carries ontological commitment, so that he could say, in a sort of neutral sense, there are things that don't exist, unicorns faster than light particles, um, other things of that sort. But he would say that he's not committing himself ontologically to them by saying things like, there are things that do not exist.
Mhm. Once again, to get to the relationship between ontological commitment and truth value,
Yeah.
you said there are things that you can make an ontological commitment to that are not true.
No, it's not so much that. The idea is that we would be ontologically committed to these things if our statements about them were true, but our statements about them are not true. So one example of this would be pretense theory. For example, Mary Leng is a philosopher of mathematics who defends a pretense theoretical view of mathematics. She says that we pretend that the axioms of set theory are true, and then we derive the theorems from those by means of logical analysis, so that it's make believe. It's a species of make believe, really. And it can be very useful in science. Applied mathematics has a wide usefulness in science. But she would say that we're not committed ontologically to these make believe entities. It's just pretense. So that would be one example. Another example would be fictionalists that you've already mentioned. People like Marc Balaguer would say that our use of mathematical language is strictly false, but it's instrumentally useful in saying the physical truth about the world. And that's all our scientific theories are really trying to get at, is the way the physical world is. And mathematics is a literally false, but nonetheless useful series of fictions that can help us to get along in the world physically.
During this period of time, was there ever an idea that you put some hope in or believe for a period of time and then had to reject by the end?
Well, I think initially, as I say, I had thought conceptualism would be the route that I would go. And I then became aware that there was really no good reason to adopt conceptualism because it's a realist view, and there's no good reason to be a realist. And then I also began to see some worries with conceptualism that began to make it look less attractive to me, and made anti-realist views look much more attractive.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions for fun. And let's say that God tells you that your anti-realism position is correct, but neutralism is not it. What would your second choice be within anti-realism?
It would be pretense theory. I really like pretense theory, that we make believe that these things exist and then we derive various conclusions. I think, for example, pretense theory provides a very good analysis of fictional characters like Mickey Mouse and Sherlock Holmes and Hamlet. These are products of pretense. And so pretense theory is very popular among literary theorists with respect to fiction. And I think Mary Lang shows very well that it can also be applied in pure mathematics. So I really like that view. There's another view called figuralism that has been defended by Stephen Yablo, who I believe is at MIT. And his view is that these mathematical objects and other sorts of abstracta are what he calls existential metaphors. They're not literally true. It is a kind of figurative way of speaking, a sort of metaphorical way of speaking. And it was very interesting to me, Robert, to discover that this is a view that C.S. Lewis actually seemed to defend and anticipate. That in Lewis's view, this kind of abstract language talk was really metaphorical, and Yablo has made a very sophisticated defense of that. So I would go with something like that, I think.
Good. Well, those are different old terms. I didn't quite get the distinction. If you can distinguish between pretense theory and fictionalism, how do you distinguish?
Okay, very good question. The fictionalist, like Balaguer, says that these statements are false, period. The pretense theorist does not say that. The pretense theorist says these are statements which are to be imagined as true. We make believe that they're true. But the pretense theorist is just neutral about their truth or falsity. He makes no commitment. He says, though, what's distinctive about these is that they are to be imagined true.
Yeah, a very good distinction on that. Okay, let's say that now God tells you that, sorry, Bill, the Platonic abstract objects are real.
Yeah.
What would then be A, your strategy to keep God absolutely sovereign, and B, what would be the question you would ask God in that context?
Yeah, the question that I would ask, well, the Lord, what are these things? Tell me. But if he remained silent and said, work it out for yourself, I would go with the conceptualist route, the classical theistic position that these are thoughts in the mind of God. I would prefer that to some sort of absolute creationist view.
And the bootstrap problem with that?
Well, I think that conceptualism is not attended by the same bootstrapping problem that absolute creationism is. Because on conceptualism, these things don't exist unless God thinks of them. It's by him thinking about being powerful that you have the property being powerful. It's a thought in the mind of God. So, explanatorily, prior to God's thinking about this property, God certainly is powerful, but he just doesn't have that property because he hasn't thought of it yet.
In that sense, the concept, though, the abstract concept of thought, then becomes explanatorily foundational to the process.
Explanatorily, prior to God's thinking about them, there aren't any of these abstract objects. But then once God thinks of them and conceives of them, then explanatorily posterior to that is all of our mathematical discourse and discourse about possible worlds and properties and propositions. All of that is explanatorily posterior to God's conceiving them.
Posterior, you have the blizzard posterior.
Yeah, there you have the blizzard, as you put it, of abstract objects.
But prior, you have thought as some kind of a foundational concept prior.
Well, it wouldn't be a concept. You would have a concrete object, you see, God, who would be explanatorily prior to his thoughts. And therefore, the properties and other sorts of things don't arise until God actually conceives them. Now, of course, we don't want our listeners to be misled here. We're not talking about a temporal priority as though there was some point in time where God hadn't yet thought these up. These are eternal, but we're talking about a kind of explanatory or ontological priority here.
How are Christian philosophers in general positioned on this whole question? Is divine conceptualism sort of the majority thought?
I think so, or Platonism. You see, the influence of Alvin Plantinga upon contemporary Christian philosophy cannot be over-exaggerated. And Alvin Plantinga, in his early work, was a Platonist. He took it for granted that propositions and properties and individual essences and possible worlds all exist as abstract objects. But then Plantinga changed his mind. And in an address to the American Philosophical Association, in his presidential address, he advocated a conceptualist view according to which these are actually thoughts in the mind of God. But given his prior influence already, I think Christian philosophy has found it difficult to shake off this Platonism that it had absorbed with its mother's milk and to follow Plantinga in his conceptualism, though certainly some have.
Bill, I noticed in going through your book at the beginning, you had a thank you at the beginning to Richard Swinburne. Richard is a great contributor to Closer to Truth, as is Al Plantinga, and I just wondered the background for that.
Well, after dedicating my early books to my wife and my children and other family members, I thought, whom can I dedicate these books to? And I thought, well, why not to other Christian philosophers who have been role models for me in my philosophical work? And so I dedicated the trilogy of my books on divine eternity and the theory of time to Alvin Plantinga, and then the book on God and abstract objects to Richard Swinburne, which seemed also appropriate because Swinburne is an anti-realist about these abstract objects.
Right, and as everyone can watch your videos on Closer to Truth, Richard's on abstract objects is also on Closer to Truth.
Okay.
Bill, I really want to seriously thank you for spending years, I didn't realize it was 13 years, but thank you on God and abstract objects. It's this deeply probative topic. It has had a significant effect on how I think about both God and abstract objects, and it really cuts to the foundation of the metaphysics of reality. So once again, thank you, and wish more of this in the future.
Thank you, Robert.
We invite viewers to watch Closer to Truth videos with William Lane Craig at closertotruth.com or Closer to Truth's YouTube channel. We'll be doing more with Bill in the future. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing.